Side of the table. I guess the podium is probably blocking their recording, so if you'll be aware of the person over here, this will be helpful. Our next speaker is George McLean. Again, regional introduction in the research community. And We Are All Mortal book is one of the modern classics, I guess, and the topic of his research today is a topic that in which I guess there's no student of the subject that has gone more deeply into that particular aspect of the case than himself, dealing with basically the mafia ties of Jack Ruby.
I remember the announcement of the journal. I think we only have one copy left, so I'm going to just leave it on the table, and if you're interested in either subscribing, contributing, or even finding out some more information, just leave me some information on the back or your card.
Everybody get his paper?
And even if you do have a copy of it, I'd appreciate it if you focused on how I'm structuring it for you rather than how it reads on the page. All right, it's rather condensed, and it would be 18 double-spaced pages, and it is in its longer form already, moving towards the monograph. It's about 30 pages long. It is supporting and enlarging a number of pages 196 through 210 in And We're All Mortal, which deals approximately with the same topic. 196 through 210 in And We're All Mortal tries to collect in some meaningful way all the references to Norman Roughhouse Rothman as he's associated with a rather complex operation from 1955 through the 60s, which involved a lot of people that you were quite familiar with. On pages 173 through 176 are the paragraphs on Jack Ruby and the so-called 302 reports. As you know, he's reporting to his FBI contact in 1959, no fewer than 8 times, when he was, in effect, a kind of triangulating between Havana and New Orleans and Dallas and sometimes Miami. So this continues that examination, and it's called Love Field. Pardon me. It's from a work in progress called The Iron Sights. It also extends a piece, or a rather long piece, from the second issue of Third Decade, called, I believe, The Dallas Connection, Who Were These Men? Love Field. On or about August 1st, 1959, Jack Ruby met 4 men and 2 women at Love Field, Dallas, Texas. Now, that company of 7 dined together at the Luau, the airport restaurant, the men apparently holding a meeting over their meal. Later, at least 2 of them, accompanied by their wives, visited Jack Ruby at his carousel club, where photos were taken of the revelers, photos which would give Ruby trouble later that same year at still another airport. That's when he was trying to go through Havana check. Several writers have presented versions of this Dallas dinner meeting and its probable import. The best is Seth Kenter in his Who is Jack Ruby, and the worst is G. Robert Blakey and Richard Billings. I pointed out that in 2 pages they make 8 errors when they deal with Jack Ruby's telephone calls in that crucial period from June through the November 18th, primarily from June through September. And they make those same errors when they write the House Select Committee on Assassinations. I now established they make the same kinds of errors and the same kind of shoddy and sloppy work in this area. So do not rely upon Blakey and Billings as they tell you about the Love Field meeting. None of the researchers has examined the 59 meeting in its historical context, reconstructing it with what came before and what followed. This paper then presents such a reconstruction. We can get at in 59 then gambling profits, heroin traffic, gun running, money laundering, and financial scams. What we find is that there were operations being run against Fulgencia Batista, Apparently, people in power decided they had enough of him. We had been hedging our bets since 1955 through Norman Rothman in support of Fidel Castro in the mountains. And we have two curves, a descending curve of support for Batista, ascending curve for support for Fidel Castro. What you need to find out is then what the relationship between those two are, how Love Field is central to that development, and how ultimately it points towards November 22nd, 1963. So it tells us, I can't say it all today here, a good deal about why Cuba was vital. It tells us about those figures who hawked both arms and drugs. It tells us about the CIA and its plots. It tells us about the agency cooperating with both the mafia and corrupt labor in offshore operations like the Castle Bank and Trust, the Bank of Nova Scotia, and finally in Australia, Nugan Hen. Then it tells us about the FBI and its spy monitoring of Cuba at the direction of J. Edgar Hoover. I wish I could do more on that, but it's, that already is 10 or 15 pages more, indicating that there is at least one instance in which Flynn said, yes, we did talk about Cuba maybe once. And of course, Jack Ruby, the multiple agent of Dallas police organized crime, the CIA, at least unwittingly, as I said to John Davis, I have no direct connection between Ruby and an actual CIA agent, but they're all around, including people like Eli Davis in this operation, and the FBI. And shortly before Ruby's meeting at Love Field, the Sicilian Mafia took over the world heroin market at a series of meetings, including the Palermo Crime Conference, all three meetings involving suspects in the assassination. 4 years later, Kennedy arrives at Love Field, as you well know, and is gunned down in Dealey Plaza on his drive from the airport to the Trade Mart. 20 years after Ruby's Love Field and Carousel Club festivities, CIA agents and syndicate figures cooperated in gutting at least 25 savings and loan institutions. And I think most of you know, if you know the Houston material and other material, that the Cobra, who received funds ultimately for the Castle Bank and Trust, is Santo Traficante, and that Carlos Marcello was in on the gutting of the S&Ls. The Love Field meeting was the reticulate center of that dark history. Reticulate as a modifier was introduced by Peter Dale Scott in his work, and it means that two-dimensional models, even a matrix, sometimes three-dimensional models won't work. So you need a four- or n-dimensional model sometimes to handle some of this work. Also, you may know a reticulate structure that's valuable, and that is the Greek key design. You move up, you move forward, you go down in depth, you go back to find out what that really meant, you go back up again and down again until you have that border that you see on Navajo rugs or around the frieze of temples. So that reticular structure in 2 dimensions suggests that you don't always go forward. Sometimes you have starburst structures or various other kind of n-dimensional structures. So we need models in this study. In conference at Love Field in August '59 were Jack Ruby, this is the cool version, Dallas strip club owner, Louis J. McWillie, and Juanita, his wife. McWillie was the manager of the Havana Tropicana Casino. Martin or Martinez Fox, one of the 2 owners of record of the Havana Tropicana Casino, and Fox's wife. Alfred McLean, E. McLean, a Dallas attorney interested in oil, minerals, and precious metals. And David McCord, also interested in precious metals with business ties to Jack Ruby's associates involved in offshore banking and investments. That evening, Fox and McWillie, with their wives, rejoin Ruby, and the pictures are taken. But what about Jack Ruby? I think you know him, but here's a summary that would help. Police officers, mobsters, intelligence agents, Jack Ruby was obsessed by them. His police and intelligence connections included his operating as a cooperative witness for the Chicago police, as a probable information source for the Chicago State's Attorney's Office, as a military policeman in the U.S. Army Air Corps. Many people don't know that. As an informer for the Kefauver Committee investigating organized crime, as an information source for the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, as an informer for the Dallas Police and its Special Services Bureau, as an informer for the FBI, and again near the end of his long and duplicitous career, as an information source for the Chicago Police. That's pretty heavy. Ruby's corrupt labor and organized crime connections were extensive. Here I can only call your attention to the most valuable reviews: Seth Cancer, David Shine, and John Davis. There are others, and I know I've missed them, but if you check those 3 out, you get a really good picture of Jack Ruby's corrupt labor and organized crime connections. Ruby's intelligence connections have been difficult to unearth, and that's probably where they're withholding the most Ruby information. But they do include several contacts with the Treasury Department's Bureau of Narcotics in 46 and 47, was subsequently moved out of Treasury, but you have to remember that this, among others, is still another Treasury connection to the assassination of John F. Kennedy. At least 8 important meetings with an FBI agent in 1959, participation in several projects from 57 through 59 directed by the CIA, or at least run by agency operatives and assets, for informing for the Special Services Bureau of the Dallas Police, again from 57 through 59 and after, a police unit with direct ties to the U.S. intelligence community, both civilian and military. Here's now where we structure out in dimensions. Sometime in 57 and continuing through 59, and I've got newspaper materials, documents, etc. for these structures. After Fidel Castro assumed power in Cuba, Hoffa, I. Irving Davidson, Meyer Lansky, Sandro Trafficante, Russell Buffalino, Norman Rothman, and their associates smuggled weapons, ammunition, and other equipment, also intending to deliver cargo planes to rebel leader Fidel Castro in support of his revolution against Fulgencio Batista. Now I'll tell you, because it's not here, and I did it the last day before I came to the conference, one missing, and very importantly, is where did the money come from? It's got to come to Cuba as early as 1957. It's got to go into the July 26 movement. It has to be in the hands of people, and Castro wittingly or unwittingly has to benefit from it. I now have that connection. So I know that the money came in. I know where it came from. If you know the map of Cuba, that fishes red Cuba, down at the corner is a corner of great intelligence and covert activity. That's Santiago and Guantanamo Base. The money came in at Santiago and was funneled into the pro-Cuban, pro-Castro operations through an intelligence connection to an organized crime connection. I'll have more to say about that in a future version of this. Simultaneously, the same people continue to work with their old friend Batista and the group supplying Castro. Lansky has the lowest profile, Norman Rothman has the highest. Somebody has to go to jail. Profit and power, ancient motives were at work. The Cuban dictator was the old ally of the old combination. He got a share of money from Lansky, Trafficante, tourism, gambling, and narcotics. And so what he could use that money for, and what he did was to buy weapons. The coalition got back its payoffs to Batista through arms sales, and also retained his goodwill. And the more you check the history of the period, the more you know that a lot of power was behind Castro. Castro had friends in the U.S. State Department, I'm certain of it, and the U.S. government, I'm certain of it, in the Cuban community in the States, it's obvious, even in the Central Intelligence Agency. They made at least 2 contacts with him. If witnesses such as Frank Sturgis, Pedro Diaz-Lance, and Ambassador Early T. Smith were to be believed, those are the old witnesses. Just as highly placed members of the U.S. government, or elements within the Central Intelligence Agency, or both, grew weary of Dominican Republic dictator Trujillo and supported his overthrow and assassination. He just got tired of him. So also plots against Cuba's strongman Batista were beginning to be mounted, covert operations that got the blessings of the American government. Money was available to support Castro. As I said, it's not in there. I didn't know until the end of the week how I could also structure that. This support for Castro from 57 through 59 and after, following his victory, accounts for Castro's reluctant but pragmatic cooperation with selected Havana casino operators and associates in 1959. For example, one with Mike McLean at the Hotel Nacional. McLean is the model for the casino operator in Havana, the motion picture that came out recently. Although in order to cover, they have that man call attention to McLean, to Mike McLean, so that you say, well, then that can't be McLean. But Alan Arkin? Yeah. Alan Arkin is playing a version of Mike McLean. McLean apparently had a reasonably clean record. He had been left there as the owner of record by the Lanskys, although on the bill of sale, in effect, it came out of Modalitz and the Silent Syndicate, the Purple Gang and the Cleveland Syndicate, who hoped that McLean might become the new boss of Cuban casino gambling under Castro. McLean stayed there for 18 months, then got out. Number 2 was Frank Farini, also known as Frank Sturgis, who had worked for Rothman and Trafficante, supporting Castro while operating covertly for U.S. intelligence out of the, you saw that I just got this information rather late, Consulate General's office in Santiago, that's the tip, and who Castro put in charge of the Air Force and inspecting the casinos and collecting a gambling tax. 3 with Santo Traficante, the man who had run Cuban tourism for Marlansky. They all betrayed Castro. Working with that group, intending to continue its control of vice operations in Havana, were members of the Miami area's Teamsters Local 320. Soldiers of fortune worked with them, mercenaries, Cuban patriots, exiles, adventurers, all of them. Most of the arms illegally shipped to Havana by this motley crew came from CIA proprietary companies in Virginia, including Inter-Armco, and was also burglarized from U.S. Army Reserve depots, and I have some other sources now. Members of this group combination included Carlos Prio Sagaros, close friend of Meyer Lansky, Robert McEwen, a co-worker with Carlos Prio, Jack LaRue, also known as Bernie Spindle, intimate of Jimmy Hoffa. He's a principal in the Marilyn Monroe Kennedy bugging store. He's the man who allegedly set up the bug so that you could get to hear the springs in the bed moving. And Jack Leon Ruby. When Fidel Castro finally made clear his intention to close down those operations directed by Lansky and company, primarily their interests in gambling and narcotics, this same coalition plotted his death. In '57, Hoffa began his major Miami Teamsters operation. He sent Roland McMaster, later to become Hoffa's contact with the plumbers, to set up Teamsters Local 320. Ultimately, he established a whole network of these operations, and as I said, stuffed with hoodlums. The linchpin of that Florida thrust was Miami Local 320. McMaster's worked with Dave Yaris in building 320, and Yaris's Cuban contacts were probably the very best. You remember, he was the Chicago link to the anti-Castro Cubans after Castro's successful revolution. McMaster was Jimmy Hoffa's personal delegate to Vito Genovese's mafia family, to the Arcado Giancana Chicago Syndicate, to the Dorfmans, to Santo Traficante, and most probably also to our friend Carlos Marcello. In 320, Yaris and McMaster were at the center of a powerful matrix of Teamster Mafia muscle and money. Police records indicate that 320 was a major narcotics operation, all right? That's in southern Florida. Lansky sponsored and supported the Traficante family in its rise to power. Traficante ultimately acted both for himself and for Lansky in Havana, in Miami, and in the South, and in the mob's Asian drug traffic. Now again, I can't do the work there, but if you look at, for example, McCoy, The Politics of Heroin, all right, number 1, and number 2, Kruger, The Great Heroin Coup, and just do those 2 books and their references, you're on your way to seeing what extraordinary dimensions your work will be given, contextualizing the assassination with the word drugs. Through Traficante's official position, though it was owner of one of the casinos, he was far more significant. He was Lansky's financial representative. He controlled the tourist industry. He was responsible for receiving bulk shipments of Sicilian heroin and forwarding them through Florida to New York and other urban centers, where their distribution was assisted by cooperating mafia bosses. I tell you very frankly that when Castro was just not threatening tourism and gambling profits, and the Kennedys were not threatening just gambling profits, they were threatening the major Sicilian mafia institution funded and abetted by in Southeast Asia, in Cuba earlier, and in the United States, possibly by certain intelligence operatives. Remember that he got cooperating mafia bosses throughout the United States for further distribution. Concurrently, Marcello is an important southern rim Gulf Coast link to this Teamsters organized crime narcotics traffic. McMaster's and Yaris's 320 was the stateside staging area for the Alliance's drug operation. Hoffa and his CIA-connected associate, I. Irving Davidson, were active in this Cuban arms market. Hoffa, Presser, that's why Presser's got this triplicity in his tradition of the Cleveland Teamsters, later both the head of the Teamsters and an FBI informant. They had an awful lot on him. And I. Irving Davidson, as a kind of unit in this structure, bought arms and were selling them to Cuba. They bought some planes and they were ferrying the weapons and planes from Florida to Cuba. Davidson admitted, I sold tremendous amounts of tanks and whatnot to Batista in '59. Now, either that's Davidson's error, he meant 1958, he couldn't have sold them to Batista in 1959, unless he meant the Dominican Republic operation. And there's a Dominican Republic operation in which a number of people associated, again, the high visibility is Norman Rothman and a little lower Jack Ruby, and then low visibility Meyer Lansky. He may mean the Dominican Republic operation in which there was an early attempt to stage a counter coup, got it? Because that's where Batista was staying and they were attempting to bring in arms for him. So he may mean 1959 and I may be in error. About a month or two before Batista fell, he says, I don't think that's true. That has to be 58 if it's before Batista fell. I delivered, Davidson said, a big package to him. A federal witness stated, I was right there on several occasions when they were loading the guns and the ammunition on the barges. The whole thing was Hoffa's way of helping his mob buddies. No longer than 1 year after Local 320 had been established by Hoffa, McMasters, Yaris, and Traficante, 1 year after Hoffa and his corrupt friends had established the dummy corporation Afros Dynamics in order to ship planes into the Cuban arms market, this coalition began sending arms and munitions through South Florida to Castro. Batista's brother-in-law got a percentage of the operations of Norman Rothman, who fronted for Lansky, the most visible of Lansky's operatives, and he began directing arms smuggling to Fidel Castro, I think as early as 55, but my best evidence is May 58. Rothman had interest in at least one casino with the Manorino brothers and with Jake and Meyer Lansky at the Lansky-Rothman Tropicana. Working there, I think you know, was Jack Ruby's close friend, Louis J. McWillie. It was a Rothman associate, possibly Louis J. McWillie himself, who approached Fiorini, the Rothman Traficante gun runner to Castro, Castro's gambling tax collector, a U.S. intelligence spy on Castro, I am certain of that, with a hit contract on Fidel Castro as early as 59. And it was the Lansky, Rothman, McWillie Tropicana to which Jack Ruby came when he visited Louis J. McWillie in 59. When Robert Mayhew recruited Traficante through his longtime friend Roselli for attempts against Fidel Castro, Traficante offered the services of, again, right, high visibility, Norman Rothman, and he offered him to Johnny Roselli. And according to FBI documents, Rothman was one of the original contacts between the syndicate and the CIA in 59 and 60 in the first agency-directed attempts on the life of Fidel Castro. No later than May of 58, Rothman began those operations about which Jack Ruby would moan when he was held in the Dallas prison cell. Remember, he said they'll find out about the guns, they'll find out about Cuba. That's what he was talking about. In fact, references to Prio, McWillie, and Ruby in the operations of the so-called casino may actually refer to these weapons deliveries to Cuba, or it may refer to drugs. Casino may be a handy way, and gambling may be a handy way to encode these operations. Evidence from a dozen sources now indicates that in the gun smuggling and munitions operations run through South Florida by Hoffa, 320, and Acros Dynamics, Ruby worked with Norman Rothman and Rothman's associates. The best short article is Armstrong's article, the research work that he did for Anthony Summers on, I think, the sidebar of the story. I think it's called Jack Ruby's Secret Life, if I'm not mistaken. It's a good article. Members of this group went to Alexandria, Virginia, and purchased arms from a CIA front company. These weapons, handled by the Rothman's people, including Sturgis and Ruby, were smuggled into Cuba. All right. Rothman then becomes an extraordinarily rich person in this structure and gives us the dimensions of the Ruby we're talking about. Documents from intelligence sources establish that Jack Ruby was a major party to these arms shipments to Cuba from 57 through 59, working with this combination, whose most visible operator was Lansky Traficante associate Norman Rothman. That Jack Ruby held the Love field meeting in 59. Alfred McLean, leading member of a prominent Dallas law firm, national reputation in federal courts for legal expertise on oil and gas leases, according to one of his partners, obsessed with making money, and according to a fellow attorney, hung out with promoters. So McLean had a dark side despite his national reputation. Through Supreme Court Justice, though Warren knew him well enough to refer to him as Alfred, McLean had what were called concealed people in his life. Certainly if McLean was interested in oil, gas, and possibly metals, hungered after the fast buck, and associated with so-called promoters, he was at exactly the right place when he met Ruby, McWillie, Fox, and McCord at the Luau restaurant in Love Field. 7 months after that meeting, McLean died in a suspicious 2-car accident in New York, reportedly killed instantly when his car hit his taxi, and then vanished. Conventional commentary simply does McLean, and then they do Santos Sorge, and they get out of the story. Seth Cantor discovered that McLean was the general counsel for Rimrock Tidelands Incorporated, an exploration firm with extensive gas, oil, minerals, and metals leases on several states. In that capacity, he shared interests with David McCord, the other lawyer present. McLean loved intrigues, had a shadowy association with Ruby. That association was defined by McLean's business partner, Santos Sorge. McLean was at the Love Field meeting serving his own interests, possibly, I'm not certain, Carlos Marcello's, certainly Santos Sorge's concerns, and the interests of those the Sorge represented. The Rothman enterprise has too often been glossed as an attempt to save the mob's gambling revenues, and hence Ruby's involvement as a munitions and equipment smuggler. But the profits that might be lost to Lansky, Traficante, and others were much higher than those from gambling, crooked, or straight. Drug traffic from Sicily to the United States ran through Cuba. From Havana it went to Florida, and then to major urban centers. Heroin was the key. Lucrative as Havana tourism and gambling was, profitable as the arms trade, the Sicilian underworld had decided in 56 and 57 there would be a new criminal order. These men were protecting the drug traffic, the sale of heroin. Batista had made money on it. The mob would control the casinos if they could. Under Castro, the drug money would continue to flow. If not, another port of entry would have to be developed. Every man at the Love Field meeting was connected to the heroin trade run by Lansky and Traficante in Cuba. January 15, 1958, 20 months before the meeting, McLean's Rimrock Tidelands creates Rimrock International Oil out of several companies, including a Sicilian company with Santos Sorge as a minor stockholder. But Rimrock, located now at 680 Fifth Avenue, had Santos Sorge as its managing director and McLean as its general counsel. Those are heavy people. Sorge was delegated by the U.S. Commission of the Mafia, Sicilian Mafia, in the United States to act as its liaison with the Sicilian Mafia and more broadly Southern Italian Mafia. In turn, Sorge was the link between the Sicilians in Europe, the Mafia in the States, and members of what have been called by Salerno the Confederation, organized crime people who were not Sicilian Mafia. In that sense, Lansky and Ruby were members of the Confederation, but only associates of the Mafia. The National Commission originally was the 5 heads of the New York families, New Orleans, enlarged in the 30s to pull in people places like Chicago. But in general, these burgeoning places of vice were represented by near neighbors. Hence, Dallas was spoken for by New Orleans family boss, though after World War II, when Dallas became an important center of corruption and shipping point for narcotics from Miami and New Orleans, Marcello oversaw the heroin traffic. But the city in general was an open area. Santos Sorge was the stateside representative of the Mafia's National Commission to Europe, speaking for the Commission in general, but for Joe Bonanno in particular. Sorge was born in 1908. Mussolini, Sicily, was a U.S. citizen, had police and intelligence files open on him in at least 3 countries. I'm trying to look for more. A member of no Mafia family. He couldn't. He was in effect senior consigliere or counselor, not to any family, but to the entire Sicilian organized crime operation. Got it? And the U.S. Mafia. It is an extraordinary figure we're talking about that McLean represented at Love Field. The Sicilian, Cuban, Florida heroin traffic generated a fortune for both groups. And so what else did they give Santos Sorge to do? He was put in charge of generating still more money out of the Mafia's international heroin profits, investing, if at all possible, in legitimate businesses. Sorge therefore represented the Mafia's international drug traffic, its worldwide investment interests, the U.S. Mafia's National Commission, and Joe Bonanno in particular. When Alfred McLean attended the Love Field meeting, he was there as Santos Sorge's recognized delegate. 3 international heroin meetings were held prior to the Love Field meeting at Binghamton, at Palermo, and Appalachia. Sorge attended at least one of those. There are a lot of meanings to those meetings. I can't take them up right now. They were all energized by Joe Bonanno. The post-war II domination of the U.S. heroin market was formalized at these 3 meetings. Claire Sterling's new book, The Octopus, I think it's a venting operation on the part of American intelligence, is useful up to a point. So if you want to take a look at that, do, but there are better texts. They established Sicily as a major base in U.S. drug trade. Each of the three meetings attempted to deal with Cuba, a major distribution point. They talked about whether they should get rid of Batista. They wondered whether the mafia could work with the rebels and its Jesuit-taught leader, Castro. From October 17th through the 19th, bosses from North America, including Canada, that's crucial, and Europe met at the Arlington Hotel in Binghamton, and Joe Bonanno again ran things. Then, through the 12th to the 16th, 1957, the Sicilian Mafia met again, this time at the hotel in Palermo, Sicily. Santos Sorge was present at that meeting as the delegate of the U.S. National Commission. Luciano was there. The major theme of that meeting was improving the drug trade. The outcome, though complex, can be given in brief as it enriches our understanding of the Love Field meeting in August 1959. Luciano would ensure discipline in handling heroin shipments as they came into the United States on the U.S. side, and his cousin, Giuseppe Giancaruso, would do the same for the Sicilian Mafia side. Sorge acted again in a new capacity as liaison between the two. Got it? So he linked the two sides in the third and most important meeting, or at least maybe the most important meeting. His connections were so powerful that in '67, federal investigators were denied access to his files. For example, U.S. Immigration and Naturalization Service withheld a Sorge file from federal narcotics officers, I think that's crucial, cooperating with a Sicilian drive against the mafia and its corruption. McLean's representation then of Sorge's concerns are enough weight, I think, to carry, but I think you have to know that I believe there is a fourth co-conspirator in addition to the House Select Committee on Assassinations trio, beyond Trafficante, Marcello, and Hoffa. I think what we're dealing with is Joe Bonanno, and we've got to find out a lot more about him. I suggest, again, that when Kruger in his book says that Joe Bonanno ran mafia concerns in Cuba, he was absolutely on target. He's not talking about tourism, he's not talking about gambling, he's talking about mafia concerns. And the mafia concerns that Bonanno was in charge of in Cuba was heroin. The Fox brothers gambling and drugs. Pedro and Martinez Fox, Martinez was called Martin, were Cuban nationals, owners of record at the Tropicana. Both were heavy gamblers, both Miami connections, both Las Vegas connections, to high-level syndicate figures. At least Martin Fox was involved in the Bonanno Lansky Trafficante drug operation. That's because I have only evidence on Martin, not on Pedro. Both Fox brothers, however, were closely associated with Norman Rothman, remember, who controlled Tropicana slot machines. When Trafficante was ousted by Castro, the Fox brothers, always part of the Tampa Havana Don's activities, moved to Miami, and they ran Traficante's Bonito gambling. As you know, Seth Cantor tracked them down. He found people, including myself, thought they were the Lansky brothers. I was in error. He found them in the phone book. It is not likely that Martin Fox would have traveled to Love Field and then to the carousel from Havana in order to, as Ruby put it, collect the gambling debt. Just as Ruby and Alfred McLean had extremely close ties to the heroin trafficking group running arms to Castro, so also were the Fox brothers, who were Lansky's delegates, business associates of Norman Rothman, and who reputedly profiting from the mafia's drug business. McWillie. McWillie, I think you know, maybe I should only add that we now know that he was making very large deposits periodically at Miami banks. I can't get him directly connected to offshore banking, but I'm pursuing that. His closest, again, to the same people suggest that the Love Field meeting, one of its major agenda items was protection of the mob's drugs. McCord and the Castle Bank and Trust. Like McLean, David McCord was a lawyer and a well-known Dallas lawyer. He was also the Fox brothers' attorney. He was the Fox brothers' representative. Hence, again, at that Love Field dinner party meeting, we have a member with direct ties to the Sicilian drug trade operating through Cuba via his client's casino, the Tropicana. McCord eventually gave up his law practice rather than suffer disbarment for being involved in a fraudulent securities business. McCord was interested in precious metals, had ties to offshore tax havens, including the Castle Bank and Trust, where the CIA and syndicate money was stashed. They cleaned up drug traffic money through it. July of '76, he was arrested on charges which included conspiracy and mail fraud in a bogus silver mine investment scheme. McCord worked with one Charles William Deaton, who number the Smaldoni family in Colorado, whom I also, by the way, have been in a silver and gold operation, but I've got to work on that. Deaton was also arrested at the request of the United States government in West Germany in October of '76, same operation, and was waiting extradition because he defrauded investors, according to the indictment, of over $30 million through a plan to extract gold and silver from worthless ore. Deaton and McCord used the Castle Bank and Trust as their financial base. McCord, Fortune, was a business associate of James Martin. I think you ought to check his, I think you know some of his connections to the case. Longtime friend of McLean's dinner party host, Jack Ruby. The McCord story ultimately leads to, and this in itself is 10 pages, right? Paul Kellywell, the establishing of the Castle Bank and Trust, the CIA and the syndicate in Southeast Asian drug traffic in cooperation with Santo Traficante, and covert financial support of the Bay of Pigs and other anti-Castro operations. That's still another story. McCord is a representative of the Fox brothers as an investment advisor and connected to offshore mafia tax havens. McLean was probably talking for Santos Sorge about where they would put the mafia money, and McCord was an investment advisor connected to offshore mafia tax havens such as the Castle Bank and Trust with its CIA syndicate and drugs and guns money, shared motives then with Alfred McLean, Martin Fox, and with Louis J. McWillie, and finally Jack Ruby, who hosted the meeting. The available evidence indicates that Jack Ruby's August '59 Love Field meeting was a conference on the handling of the Castro problem in Cuba as the rebel leader threatened the Sicilian mafia's drug trade through the island. Montreal, or Central America, Catroni in Montreal was Bonanno's man. He set it up as a Bonanno operation. Montreal, or Central America, or Mexico, all discussed at the early Binghamton, Palermo, and Appalachian meetings were probably examined or reported on. Information was exchanged with Norman Rothman in continuous legal trouble. His problems were absolutely extraordinary. In fact, I think he was out on bail when this meeting was being held, but he couldn't come to the meeting. Indicted and convicted several times, 257 and 59, Ruby apparently carrying messages at this time between Cuba, Miami, Dallas, and New Orleans. Drug profits could be channeled into legitimate investment, or illegitimate if that had to be done. Or they could be banked safely away from the offending eyes of the U.S. Internal Revenue Service and the Castle Bank and Trust. Other ports of entry could be worked out. But Cuba had been so handy, and could be again. What to do about Castro was finally resolved when, after the closing of the casinos, Meyer Lansky, the financial genius behind the drug operations that concerned the men at Love Field in August of '59, offered a $1 million contract for the assassination of Fidel Castro. Thank you.
Articulate?
That's a ridiculous.
Yeah, thank you. Peter Dale, Scott Lewis. Martin.
Make a few comments there. Just make a few comments here. A lot of good information pulled together on Ruby's various intelligence involvements. You'll notice that the one document, one connection that isn't made is the 1947 connection, which is talked about sometimes. The document that's based on is a forgery. It's got a zip code. It was done in 1947. The zip codes didn't come in until 1962. So that document's reprinted in Robert Morrow's book, The Sign Must Die. You can ignore it completely. The mention of the CIA support for Castro, there was kind of a left wing of the CIA, a right wing of the CIA, and the left wing was supporting Castro and the right wing wasn't. And so there's a lot of stuff going on within the agency as far as who's doing what in Cuba. For anyone following up information on Bernie Spindell, he wrote a book a while back about electronic eavesdropping and his involvement in that. On Roland McMaster, the Hoffa aide, there's a lot of material on him in Stephen Brill's book on the Teamsters and also in Dan Moldea's book, The Hoffa Wars. Dave Yaris is a name that's come about in connection with Ruby. And so a number of the books on Ruby and organized crime talk about Yaris. And it's kind of fortunate that Joe Bonanno comes into this, because on New Orleans, the FBI had very little coverage of the New Orleans Mafia. On the San Luis County in Florida, very little coverage. On the New York Mafia families, the FBI has a lot of coverage. There's a lot of eavesdropping, a lot of tapes, a lot of transcripts. The Assassinations Committee had some of that. So there's a lot of material to go through in this. It gives us kind of a new direction to come at some of this. Also, Gabe Talese wrote a book with the cooperation of Bonanno's son, which might provide some interesting information.
I can comment. There's a couple of other excellent sources on information related to this. George Michael mentioned Politics of Heroin by Alfred McCoy. That book has recently been republished in an updated form. It had originally been published in '72 by Harper and Row. An updated, expanded version has now been published by Lawrence Hill. It's somewhat hard to find right now, but it's well worth looking for. It has a lot of historical background on the heroin trade, back going to basically about the Middle Ages, but a lot on the situation in the 50s and 60s. Strongly recommended reading. In addition, Alfred McCoy, the author, was interviewed by Z Magazine in, I believe, the January issue. That's also worth checking out. And on the comments he made about the savings and loans fiasco, if someone cannot find the Houston Post articles written by Tom Bruton, Z Magazine also, and I believe the May issue, I could be wrong on that, but they reprinted the Texas Observer's interview with Tom Bruton, who had authored that series of articles.
Pete Bruton.
Oh, Pete Bruton. I'm sorry, Pete Bruton.
Yeah, I have copies of those articles at home if anybody wants them.
Oh, okay, great. Okay.
All right, I'm sorry to say this, I must have missed something, but my understanding is that the third decade is not dealing with Robert Kennedy's murder, not dealing with Martin Luther King's murder, not dealing with intelligence affairs generally, or the mob, or this or that. George, could you tell us what the connection is here, if any, with the research that we're doing into John Kennedy's murder? What's the purpose of this?
Yes, I think it's pretty obvious, if you've read my book, that I believe that the same people who ran operations against Fidel Castro killed John F. Kennedy. That's a speculative conclusion of mine. I made it a lot softer in the last page of my book. What I then must do is try to establish a kind of complex but recognizable chronology involving those same people, so that those people who eventually got rid of Batista and supported Castro.
Is this guilt by association, or is this, do you have any hard evidence?
Do you want to talk, or do you want me to talk?
No. Okay, go ahead. I apologize for interrupting you.
Thank you. So that those people responsible for the attempts on the life of Fidel Castro could be more closely connected to, in what I think is the most conservative estimate of who was responsible for the death of John F. Kennedy, the conclusions of the House Select Committee on Assassination, which named Carlos Marcello and Santo Traficante, the staff added, and the staff added anti-Castro Cubans supported by, financed by, and vetted by the Central Intelligence Agency.
Wait, what did you say the House Committee did or said? Or Blake?
You are provocative and insulting.
No,
And I'm going to tell you, you're a most disruptive force at this meeting.
Well, I think that we should pin down what you're talking about here. What did you just say?
I missed it.
What did you just say about the House Committee?
The House Committee named Marcello and Traficante as prime suspects in the assassination of
They
President.
did not, they said.
They named them as prime
suspects.
suspects. That's why they're included in the discussion, because if you're looking for motive, and if you're looking for suspects, you have to automatically include the Mafia, the CIA, the Cuban exiles, a whole gamut of people as possible suspects.
I believe I believe that they said that Marcello and Traficante had the means and the opportunity, and what was the third one?
The motive.
And the motive. I'm pretty sure that's almost word for word.
And then what did they say? And then what was the rest of the
Obviously, you can't
paragraph?
publish a book and
evidence to
accuse
indict.
somebody of killing anybody unless you can prove it, or you're going to be sued, or else knocked off. But they certainly said that those two particular mob leaders had the means, opportunity, and what's the other one? Oh, and the motive. And I'm sure most people here would agree that.
Or let them get off because you charged them without enough evidence to prove.
There were very
they
careful
get
disclaimers in the rest of those paragraphs in the report of the committee explaining
You know
why
what,
they
I'm
could
not
not
talking
have
about
done
the
it.
House Select Committee on Assassination. I'm talking about a research paper in progress that I try to give to you very carefully, all right? And you're obfuscating and obscuring the point. The point is that people involved in supporting the Batista who withdrew their support, who then attempted to off Castro, most probably were involved in the assassination of John F. Kennedy, period.
That's the Jack Anderson, Johnny Roselli theory.
No, that's the George Michael Eva presentation here. Don't bring other names in it. Don't suggest I've got connections. Listen,
No, I didn't say that. I just
what was
wanted
the
to
Jack
know what
Anderson
the
stuff
connection-
about?
What the hard
I have never
evidence is
talked to,
connecting these
spoken
people
to, or
this
written
murder.
to Jack Anderson. Jack Anderson does have several close connections to the Central Intelligence Agency, however. What is your
It's
thrust
very
about?
important here for us to examine the whole question of whether or not, if somebody has evidence that the CIA was involved or that the Mafia was involved, let's hear it. But let's not do this by guilt by association or innuendo.
Look, you can hear him.
What is the evidence here?
Can I interject?
Sir.
There's a gentleman named Howard Hunt who was in charge of the Bay of Pigs invasion, who was removed by John F. Kennedy. And John F. Kennedy also ordered the closure of the Mafia-controlled bases in Cuba that were mercenaries. Howard Hunt is from Hamburg, New York. He's a 1936 graduate of Hamburg High School. If you go, and I've seen a computer analysis done on TV of Howard Hunt and the association with the holes that were connected, he was in the research. I think if you key into Bethesda, Maryland, and Howard Hunt, I think you're going to find that gentleman named Sturgis was also present at Dallas. And I've gone to the site, and I think there's definitely some loose ends with the Dallas Police Department. If you were to get in there, and you're going to find that the CIA had a direct involvement in the assassination through a gentleman who said, and I think he's on tape, he said very angrily that he was going to get back at Mr. Kennedy when he was removed from the head of the Bay of Pigs division.
Charles Cabell, General Charles Cabell.
He was fired by Kennedy after.
That's correct. And also,
his brother was the mayor.
what I'm saying is that the CIA Mafia connection is got to be.
All right, but all I'm asking here is, and don't get upset, I'm just asking for where in all that, I missed it because it was read fast and so on, but where is a specific connection that establishes in some way that this bunch, merely because Ruby is somehow involved, he shot Oswald, and we all know that he did it because he felt for Mrs. Kennedy. But does this implicate the Mafia in John Kennedy's murder? What evidence is there that Marcello somehow did it? How could they forge the photographs and x-rays of the president's body? How could they get to the Chief Justice? How could they get this stuff out of the National Archives? You think that the Mafia did this? Please prove it.
I think the sinister connection, the point that is to be made was a dark, sinister connection between elements of the CIA and the Mafia in connection with Castro's assassination. And I think that apparatus that the CIA set up and was training to guerrillas to go in there for the Bay of Pigs and then later just to go in and kill Castro, turned then essentially against President Kennedy because they felt that he had become a traitor by refusing the cover in the Bay of Pigs and then by promising Khrushchev that he wouldn't invade at all.
And I don't want to take the weight off the probable involvement of Mafia and or Confederation figures in the assassination, or at least the intention to profit by his removal by switching to an attack upon the Central Intelligence Agency. I did say at the beginning that I now have evidence that there was an American intelligence connection to the operation right from 1957 on, that money came through Santiago, it came from an American intelligence source. So we're talking about American intelligence early supporting getting rid of Batista and supporting Castro. And the same group, supported by American intelligence with heavy money into Santiago, is a group that I think is at least in part or maybe greatly responsible for the assassination of John F.
I'd
Kennedy.
just like to say, this is what we need here, is a good, hot discussion. This is the first time we've all been together.
Bernie stood up. Now, I saw him, he supposedly had a recording that has Robert Kennedy in the bungalow.
I know about that.
And the state police of New York, when they arrested him, he said it on TV, it's on tape. He says the New York State Police have those tapes that have Robert Kennedy supposedly saying, "Is she dead?" Okay.
Jimmy Hoffa also said he had the tapes, and third person said he had the
Now,
tapes.
Jimmy Hoffa ordered him to plug the bungalow. Now, from what I understand, from what I have been able to research, that there was two CIA operatives that murdered Marilyn Monroe with a injection, one in the buttocks, or one in the fingertip, I believe, and one in the armpit. So you've got a connection going all the way, not only with Robert Kennedy, with association with the mafia, the CIA. You've got a split in the CIA that Howard Hunt was the far right. You've had a group during the Cuban Missile Crisis where Kennedy, I've researched this quite a bit, that Kennedy did not have control of the armed forces. When he ordered the blockade, the Navy actually moved the blockade closer to Cuba. He was trying not to have a confrontation with Khrushchev. The Navy, he was not in control of his Navy, his Air Force. He was not in control, and he was afraid that a war was going to start. And I think that at that point in time, you've got a situation with the CIA that the president became expendable at that point.
It's certainly true that among U.S. intelligence operatives and structures, there was, as you said, not only a split in the Central Intelligence Agency, but splits all along the line. And one of the possibilities, I think you well know this, is that through the Office of Security, a kind of separate mini CIA, a lot of operations, including assassination attempts, were run. Yes,
Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to continue this in the hallway. Our coffee break is here. Coffee juice. The discussion that was being held at the end before we had the coffee break, which I thought was well timed, will be continued in an arena yet to be determined. Our next presenter is a man who's been the ecstasy and agony of my life recently as an actor of the third decade, Peter Whitney. I'm kidding about the agony part, but if you're a third decader, you know that Peter has done a number of very thorough pieces of research on quite a range of different topics, including a couple of issues ago, his piece on Richard Giesbrecht. Right. You pronounce that name right? Yeah, probably. And true to the thoroughness of the kind of research that he does, Peter doesn't let go of a thing, probably at any point. So there'll be continuations of whatever research he's doing from probably now into well into the fourth decade and maybe the 21st century. So with that irreverent introduction, Peter Whitney.
I'm really pleased to be here. Some of you, I might have mentioned I was in a car accident a week ago, and I don't want to think of the possibility that someone was trying to rub me out, but they did drive through a stop sign 5 blocks from where they live, a young Vietnamese fellow, and drove on the side of my car with my son and I, and fortunately we had our seatbelts on, rolled the car, ended up in the farmer's field. I got 8 stitches, and my son's fine. The other guy wasn't hurt, and pretty scary. Our car was totaled, and I'll tell you, but our illustrious insurance company in British Columbia government insurance plan. I talked them into paying my way. The difference between coming by buses I was going to originally and flying. So managed to get here thanks to our great insurance corporation of British Columbia. The lady that handled my case is probably going to get fired, but that's her problem. Anyway, I'm going to spend the next 6 months promoting our insurance company wherever I go, and that'll make it important. Okay, I was sort of thinking of just going through the documents that I've managed to accumulate since I wrote my article, but it could be a bit confusing because I don't have multiple copies of them. But you're welcome afterwards if you want to look through. I've got them pretty well in chronological order and a few excerpts from our articles that are referred to. Okay, so I know it looks kind of long. It's 30 pages, but it's double spaced. So let's go through it, and I'll try to keep an eye on the clock and finish in a half an hour. See what you think of it. The Man Who Heard Too Much was my article originally, and this is an update. Those of you who read my article entitled "The Man Who Heard Too Much," and if you didn't, it'll probably make sense as we go along. In the November 1990 edition of the Third Decade, undoubtedly had some reservations about the reliability of the sources cited in support of the late Richard Giesbrecht's Winnipeg airport allegations. In the course of my research, I had applied through the Freedom of Information Act for documents from the FBI dealing with this aspect of the investigation. But although I was given a file number, I wasn't very optimistic that I would even be eligible for materials related to Giesbrecht, given the fact that I am not a resident of the United States. I was assured in May 1990 that my request would be handled as soon as possible, but was told by phone when I sort of in frustration called them one day to expect at least a 9-month delay. After waiting a year altogether, I decided to go ahead and write my article based on the secondary sources that I had managed to accumulate. And sure enough, shortly after mailing my report, The Third Decade, which Jerry very kindly published, a thick envelope arrived in the mail containing FBI material, reports, memos, teletypes, radiograms, magazine articles related to Giesbrecht, along with documentation about Marilyn Dorothea Merritt and Professor Harold R. Isaacs, which were also included in my original request. Earlier this year, I made an additional Freedom of Information request, having contacted the Minneapolis FBI office, whom I had learned were in charge of the Giesbrecht investigation, and received several additional documents. This was just a couple of months ago. And also was able to locate 3 teletypes to headquarters, which I haven't received yet. They're sending them to me by separate mail for some reason. Maybe they have to go over them and blank certain things out. But anyway, 2 were teletypes from Minneapolis to headquarters, and 1 was from Dallas to headquarters, and they had a copy of it, which will be sent to me in due course. In addition, I have recently made a Freedom of Information request for a possible report on Charles Isaacs, who was listed in the notebook belonging to Jack Ruby, referred to in the Curtis Larry Crawford interview. By the way, his real name is Curtis Larry, he just made up. A second source of information, briefly referred to by William Turner in Ramparts magazine, was provided most unexpectedly. I'll tell you, I was so pleased, by a Third Decade reader and researcher named Bill Adams. How many of you are familiar with Bill? I think he's corresponding with quite a few people. He's from San Jose, who had coincidentally developed a similar interest in the Winnipeg incident. Like myself, he had received a memo from the late Bud Fensterwald early last year, which made, you might have got this, which made reference to the Boxley file, which ARC had managed to obtain. Oddly enough, in reply to a letter that I wrote to Fensterwald in '87, he had stated that he and Gary Shaw had visited him, in quotes, twice before his death in Texas. This is Bud Fensterwald a few years ago. He was ex-CIA and did a lot of good work for Garrison. His files would be very valuable, but have disappeared since his death. Gary and I have made serious attempts to locate them, but with no luck. According to Jim Lazar, who I checked with recently, the files were obtained from Boxley's widow, who had previously been reluctant to turn them over to anyone. Included in the document sent to me by Adams was CD 645, the FBI report on Giesbrecht, dated March 5th, 1964, which for some reason had not been included in the document sent by the FBI. So when they sent me a bunch of documents, they didn't send me the most important one for some reason. So I got it from Bill. I also received a short memo from William Turner to Garrison, dated August 18, 1967, which made reference to, quote, the news clip that appeared in the Canadian newspaper a few months after the assassination, unquote, along with Turner's suspicions related to Chuck Isaacs and Ruby's notebook. Oddly enough, as mentioned in my article, Turner had told me that he was not aware of the articles written in Canada. when I spoke to him on the phone, and had derived his information from Giesbrecht, about Giesbrecht from Garrison's office. So when I did originally speak to him, he led me to believe that he didn't even know about these sources, but this was not the case. The Boxley file also included a November 1767 article about Professor Harold Isaacs at MIT, along with references to Professor Lincoln Bloomfield and Walter Rostow, amongst others, published in the Herald of Freedom, an extreme right-wing journal published in Zarephath, New Jersey. Is that correct? Several references, most uncomplimentary and undoubtedly libelous, to Professor Isaacs had been underlined, emphasizing his communist background and connections to the CIA-funded Center for International Studies. So these guys, they're accusing him of being a communist, but also being in the CIA, and that the CIA therefore was infiltrated by the Communist Party. At the top of the front page, in longhand, was written, page 66, Ramparts, names Harold Isaacs, see last page, CIA, MIT. In brackets, the Garrison Commission article by Turner in Ramparts, January 68, is the reference they're making. The reference to Harold Isaacs is to a resident of Texas who had been located by an unnamed Garrison investigator, Boxley, I later learned. A classified Warren Commission document, CD 1080, which was also sent to me, is cited by Turner entitled Harold Isaacs, with a clear implication that the man from Texas was the subject of this report, which he wasn't. But at that point, they seemed to think that that report was about a man from Texas named Harold Isaacs. Below Turner's memo in large print was the home phone number of Harold R., along with his employment address and phone number, a used car lot in Houston. Two additional documents in the Boxley file also sent to me included a letter from an American Airlines pilot in Dallas named Thad Vanderberg to Garrison, dated March 4th, 68. I've managed to locate him. He's actually still alive, 71 years old, in which he made reference to a recent article, not identified, but which turned out to be National Enquirer. So this man wrote a letter, and he made reference, he didn't actually specifically state where he read it, but he made reference to a magazine article, and that was what prompted him to write this letter to Garrison, in which a Garrison aide had expressed interest in locating Chuck Isaacs, which they'd spelled wrong. Mr. Vanderberg, now retired, living in College Station, Texas, if you feel like contacting him, knew a man with that name who now resided in San Francisco, also employed by the same airline. Vanderberg described him as, quote, quite personable, alert, intelligent, and somewhat of an operator, unquote. The top of the letter was written to archives, 4 lead files, copy to Boxley, followed by a comment signed JG, which I presume is Jim Garrison. This appears to be correct as far as Chuck Isaacs is concerned. He was in Ruby's notebook. He is a pilot. As it turns out, he wasn't a pilot. Below the body of the letter was written in reference to Chuck Isaacs, Harold R. Isaacs, Houston told Boxley this Chuck Isaacs was his first cousin, and then it's cut off. I didn't get the rest of it, I guess. The final document from the Boxley file is an undated, unsigned, and typewritten summary of the Harold R. Isaacs investigation requested by Tom, undoubtedly Tom Bethel, a young British immigrant who had moved to New Orleans after previously teaching math at a Virginia prep school and an avid jazz enthusiast. As described in his 88 book, Electric Windmill, which Mr. Bethel told me about on the phone, which was published coincidentally by Rigneri Gateway. Bethel had been teaching at a business school in Baton Rouge in '66, where coincidentally Perry Russo had moved, while reading about the assassination in his spare time, and subsequently ended up being hired as an investigator for Garrison, who he met through a girlfriend. After spending several months in the archives producing a list of possibly relevant classified documents, Bethel traveled back and forth to Dallas and New Orleans, where he became good friends of the Hollands, in quotes. Later, he referred to them as the Flints in a chapter on the 1984 Republican Convention, who in fact were Mary and Buck Farrell. I don't think Mary will mind me saying this because she did actually confirm in a letter that the references to the Hollands was actually to her and her husband. Having corresponded with Mary for several years, I learned that the typewritten summary had been prepared by Mary, who attempted to assist Garrison prior to the Shaw trial. Her summary, most likely written in late '67 or early '68, provided background information on Harold R. Isaacs. So Mary herself was trying to find out more about this Isaacs fellow, formerly of Dallas, whose whereabouts at this point had not been clearly established, although his parents believed he was living in Houston. Reference was made to the, quote, clipping from the Winnipeg paper. In conclusion, however, Mary stated somewhat ambiguously that there is no connection between Chuck Isaacs and Ruby's notebook and our Harold Isaacs. I determined this in June. I can send you all my reasoning on that point if you would like, but it is very conclusive. I did write to Mary to get a clarification on who she means by our Harold Isaacs, Unfortunately, because of her health, she hasn't had a chance to respond. Presumably, our referred to Isaacs of Texas, not Professor Isaacs of MIT. Although Mr. Isaacs from the Houston area did have a cousin named Chuck in Dallas. Because it goes to show, you've got to be careful with names. This guy, it turned out, he did have a cousin named Chuck in Dallas, who lives in nearby Royce City today. He had never worked for American Airlines and was not the man identified by Thad Vandenberg. Just another Chuck Isaacs. After reading Vandenberg's intriguing letter, I was, of course, anxious to locate the man, if he was still alive, and phoned the only listed number in Dallas under that last name, which turned out to be a niece who kindly gave me her uncle's phone number. After writing to him, I subsequently received a reply, this was quite recently, in which he mentioned having bumped into Charles Isaacs at O'Hare Airport, Chicago, around 1970. He learned that Isaacs had moved to San Antonio the previous year and was working for another company in sales. Contrary to Garrison's comment, Isaacs was not a pilot, but was a ticket or ramp agent who sometimes helped in customer relations. He and Vandenberg had been transferred to Dallas from Tulsa, Oklahoma in the early 60s. By the way, I did speak to Thad the other day just to get a bit of clarification, and in his capacity, he would have been at Love Field. His job as ticket ramp agent would have placed him at Love Field. Okay. Today there are 6 listings in San Antonio under the name Isaacs, along with 3 unlisted numbers under the names Gary, Lisa, and Mary, possibly relatives. I have written to their library for telephone listings, and I did get a response, but no Chuck Isaacs was ever listed there. Earlier, I wrote to the San Francisco library and received helpful listings from 66 to 69. There were 2 Charles Isaacs listed until 69, one of whom still lives there, and I spoke to him after writing, and he didn't know what the heck I was talking about. However, sure enough, there was another Harold R. Isaacs, another Charles Isaacs, Charles H. Isaacs, so that's the one that's still listed. No, here we are. Backtrack here. The other, Charles H. Isaac, was no longer listed as of 69. This is most likely the man listed in Ruby's notebook. So so far I've been able to determine that yes, indeed, Thad's colleague did move to San Francisco, did have a listed phone number, and his name is Charles H. Isaacs, but I don't know where he is now. Darn it. Okay, anybody know where he is? Vandenberg also told me that he actually met Ruby on a flight from Chicago. This is incredible. Vandenberg, who was a co-pilot, he met Ruby on a flight from Chicago in the early 60s when he was co-pilot. Ruby had spoken to him during the flight, inviting him to visit his club along with as many stewardesses as possible. It's also possible that some of the hostesses associated with Bobby Baker's Ocean City, Maryland club that opened in July '62, which coincidentally was called the Carousel, possibly they were stewardesses too. It's just occurred to me that they look more like stewardesses than prostitutes. But Vandenberg indicated to me that he was invited by Ruby at no charge, but he did not care for him and never went to his club. He did, he had smart move. He just didn't particularly like Jack's style or anything, so he just stayed away from the place. He was under the impression that, quote, someone had told Garrison that Oswald had met with Ruby in one of Ruby's clubs, and that he thought Charles Isaacs was in the club at the time and could possibly verify this. I do not recall any mention of Charles' cousin. I was not contacted by anyone from Garrison's office. So there is a possibility that Charles Isaacs hung out at the Ruby's club and possibly either bumped into Oswald or somebody that looked a hell of a lot like Oswald. And as we all know, there were a lot of people that did claim they either saw Oswald or somebody a lot like him at various times at the Carousel. It should be pointed out that during the interview with FBI agents Hall and Clements, dated December 21st, Ruby stated that he traveled to New York in June '63 via American Airlines, returning by way of Chicago, where he met with members of his family at O'Hare Airport. He also stated that he had visited Tulsa, amongst other places, in '56 in the course of promoting a young Negro tap dancer and drummer referred to as Little Daddy. So it's possible that Ruby met Charles Isaacs either in Tulsa back in '56 or in the course of purchasing his ticket for the flight to New York. So, I got to be careful not to get too carried away. He might simply just met him because he did take that airline to New York or back in Tulsa. In Ruby's notebook, published in the Warren Commission volumes, he also had written American Airlines below the name Ralph Paul, his business partner, although this might also refer to George Senator, his roommate, whose name is listed directly below an entry that says Tuesday, October 9th, number 985-11-11:30 a.m., which sounds like an air flight following American Airlines. A most valuable source of information, so that's basically everything on the Boxy file that I managed to obtain. So that's one area of sort of primary sources. A most valuable source of information about the Giesbrecht incident, although secondary in nature, is an article on the subject published in the January 28, 1968 edition of National Enquirer. And I know we all hate National Enquirer, but actually back then I did discover that they were trying to improve their image a bit, and possibly they were trying to become another USA News Today. But here's the article, and it's very long. It's back then they were like Life magazine was quite a big printout, and it's 3 full pages. So it's quite a thorough article. Co-written by 5 staff members. I've given their names here, 4 of whom apparently are no longer with the tabloid. Now this is possible breakthrough. Ian Calder, however, has since risen to the position of president and senior editor-in-chief. So I wrote to him, and apparently he's busy right now. They're going public. It's going to be a public corporation, and they're also starting to sell it in England and Europe, and apparently he's traveling a lot. But hopefully I'll get a reply from him. I have learned from his secretary that he's extremely busy, but he'll be back in a couple of weeks. I had originally learned about Giesbrecht's contact with National Enquirer through my contact with John Ruddy, the former McLean's writer, who now lives in St. Catharines, not too far from here, who was responsible for the November '67 report in which Giesbrecht's name was given for the first time, along with a photo which later appeared in the Kennedy Conspiracy by Paris Flamand, which some of you might have seen, which the photographer didn't know about, I found out. Ruddy recalled that Giesbrecht had dropped by their office in Toronto shortly after his interview. They were supposedly on their way to Florida, paid by the Enquirer for an exclusive interview, although I have learned since that the tabloid was in New Jersey till '71. However, their printing facilities were in Florida, so there's a possibility that they gave him a free trip to Florida in exchange for this interview. Ruddy recalled hearing from his editor that Giesbrecht and his friend had ended up in some kind of trouble while in Florida, which someone had jokingly said that it'd make a more interesting story than the Kennedy story. Possibly the experience in Florida was enough to persuade Giesbrecht not to return to the United States as planned for the Shaw trial, which he had agreed to testify at, especially after the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy. The trial, as you might recall, was supposed to start in about February of '68, but there were lots of legal maneuvers that it went all the way to the Supreme Court, and by the time it finally started in January '69, 2 more of America's distinguished leaders had been knocked off, and possibly maybe Giesbrecht decided best to stay in little old Winnipeg. I also became aware of the National Enquirer report and a specific date as a result of a January 15th memo. Now I'm getting to the FBI stuff, okay? Summarizing its content, sent to me as part of my request. Oddly enough, although Hoover himself personally requested a copy of the article mentioned at the beginning of this memo, and the memo itself, I was not sent a copy of the article originally. However, I was able to obtain it from Priscilla Badger, formerly of Time magazine. She was with Time for 17 years, from 1959 to 1976, in the research department, who is now in charge of what they call research at the tabloid, although she was totally unfamiliar with the content. Paul Hope was the one that suggested I contact her personally after I wasn't able to obtain this article. And he had actually found her very helpful about 10 years ago. He said quite often he either wrote or phoned her for information, mainly to do with Cuban aspects. Okay, much of the Enquirer report is a summary of Giesbrecht's recollections, which by and large are consistent with CD 645, which did not, this is really important, the FBI report CD 645 did not give his name, but instead referred to him as MPT-1, with a business acquaintance who verified his reliability as a witness being designated as MPT-2. It should be noted, however, that the FBI report was not written by the man that interviewed him, Nelson, which I thought at first was the case, but was written by Special Agent Ewald Carlson in Minneapolis, based on Nelson's notes. Now, I don't know if that's standard procedure for one guy to interview someone and someone else to write the report, but it doesn't make much sense to me. I don't know why Mr. Nelson couldn't write his own report, but anyway, a covering section later sent to me from headquarters indicates that the report was to be classified confidential and therefore was not available to researchers, at least in 1964. So back then, they decided, because Mr. Giesbrecht didn't want his name mentioned, presumably, to not only not mention his name, but not to make it available. Presumably it was declassified later on when he allowed his name to be published. The tabloid made reference to the name Isaacs and quoted Louis Ivan of Garrison's office as attempting to locate such a man, but it aired in a statement that the name came up again in the Warren Commission report. They sort of assumed that this Isaacs was Martin Isaacs. In fact, although the Warren report did make reference to the Oswald's contact with the New York Social Welfare Office, they didn't identify the man by name who had interviewed the Oswalds, named Martin Isaacs. Later, his interview was published in one of the 26 volumes, and the index for the first 16 volumes. If you look under Isaacs in the index, you will see a listing for not only Martin Isaacs, but Chuck Isaacs. Now, Vandenberg indicated to me that his colleague did go by Chuck instead of Charles. The tabloid clearly suggested at the outset of the possibility of a cover-up on the part of the Warren Commission in not mentioning the Giesbrecht incident, but I tend to suspect that CD 645 was probably never discussed by the Commission or even the staff, given the FBI's conclusions that it was a hoax. They stated this in a May 5th memo from Brannigan to Sullivan. Now, some of you might know more about FBI personnel than I do, but Brannigan appears to be an assistant to Sullivan in Washington. And he wrote a memo to Sullivan which summarized the Winnipeg original story of May 2nd, citing the negative impressions of a man named Richard Vincent, who I was hoping to interview on the way, but because of my accent I wasn't able to. He was station manager of the ABC affiliate in Pembina, North Dakota, right on the border. And Giesbrecht had contacted him prior to going to the local paper. And after being interviewed by the FBI, he actually phoned him, trying to get his story on American television. This memo also identified Giesbrecht's lawyer by name, Harry Backlund, who I managed to locate in British Columbia, and he sent me an audio tape. So basically, this Inquirer article for the first time mentioned a man named Richard Vincent, who the FBI had referred to way back in '64 in one of their memos. The FBI had become aware of Vincent as a result of contact that he made with the Grand Forks office on or about April 1st, which resulted in an urgent, and I put that in quotes, urgent and coded radiogram being sent to headquarters. A copy, I was sent a decoded copy. In the decoded copy, Vincent, and his name was blacked out 6 times, according to the copy, he had telephoned the FBI with a summary of Giesbrecht's allegations, who had been phoning him for several weeks. Vincent also was aware of the fact that Giesbrecht had been interviewed by the FBI. He contacted ABC News in New York, who were not interested in the story. And I find it hard to believe, at that point in '64, they wouldn't be interested in this story, of a man hearing 2 guys talking about the assassination at the Winnipeg airport, and then being followed by a third man who was pretty big and thuggish looking. And, and then this guy had subsequently been interviewed by the FBI. You'd think ABC News would be interested, wouldn't you? At least in '64. And they weren't, apparently. Now, this might not be relevant, but I did discover that John Daly, I'd sort of forgotten this, but John Daly was Earl Warren's son-in-law, and he just happened to be vice president in charge of news, special events, and public affairs for ABC, as well as host of What's My Line, as you might remember, and a colleague of Dorothy Kilgallen, who had interviewed Jack Ruby in Dallas through her friend Melvin Belli. She was the only, as you might know, she was the only person allowed to interview Ruby, other than the authorities. So I'm sort of wondering, maybe ABC was told, we don't want any controversial stuff about the assassination. Just Oswald did it. Let's not try to stir up anything else. So, forget it. Vincent suggested to Giesbrecht that he contact the local paper in Winnipeg, but that Giesbrecht had continued to be persistent in bringing his story to the attention of the American public. He also suggested to Vincent that he feared for the safety of his family. That's mentioned right in the memo. The radiogram stated that Vincent would be interviewed by the FBI, but that Giesbrecht would not be re-interviewed. So they were planning to interview Vincent after his phone call. Although not sent to me initially, I did subsequently receive a copy of the Vincent interview, which I just got a couple months ago. And it was dated April 6th, and this was about 6 days after the telegram was sent off. And it was conducted by the Minneapolis office with references to Carlson's earlier report and a March 31st radiogram. I think that's the coded version, and I got the decoded one, which was dated April 1st. According to Vincent, he had received a tip from a man calling himself Mr. Smith in mid-March and was provided the lawyer's phone number, which he called. Vincent called Backlund and talked, and they had a conversation, and Backlund invited him to come to his office to look at the file. However, Vincent did not make such a visit, which I learned from Mr. Backlund. When later contacted by Giesbrecht, Vincent told him that ABC News wasn't interested, referring to him, Mr. Giesbrecht, as another nut, quote unquote. On March 28th, Giesbrecht drove to Pembina in a severe winter storm and identified himself by his true identity. Several lines at this point in the FBI report have been blanked out, more than just his name. You know, it looks like about 2.5 lines. Giesbrecht appeared to describe the airport conversation in more detail than previously, with emphasis on the references to Isaacs, although he did not reveal the name to Vincent. He mentioned having been followed by, this is what Giesbrecht had to say to Vincent. He mentioned that he'd been followed by one of the men at the airport, whom he had managed to avoid after the crowd, later contacting the RCMP. He also stated that on March 18th he had attended, this is it's almost like an aside, but it's kind of, if you put yourself in Giesbrecht's place, this might really be significant. He mentioned that he had gone to a funeral, 3 cousins, maybe it was a car accident. Where have I got it here? He attended a funeral of 3 cousins on his own while his children were in school, which made him aware of the finality of death, and, quote, and that after death there's nothing that can be said. He mentioned to Vincent that a friend had urged him to contact the television station because of their contacts in New York, quote, who could check out the story. So, he's in, a middle-sized city in the middle of Canada, and obviously talked to at least one friend about it, and and it was given probably pretty logical advice. Try to contact, an American station that can, in turn, contact, the New York office rather than just sort of contacting local media. Giesbrecht was concerned for his safety, but also indicated that if something should happen to him and no one learned of it, then what? He suspected that they might have obtained his license plate number as he left the airport, and, quote, did not think that publicity would further jeopardize his or his family's safety. I guess he felt that at this point, they knew him already, so why hide out in his house, sort of. But also stated that he, quote, he would like to get his family out of Winnipeg. Vincent told Giesbrecht that he could not afford to give him money, which Giesbrecht did not appear to be interested in obtaining. He clearly was more interested in the public knowing about his experience, although he felt, quote, it should be worth something. Now, I don't see any reason why a person shouldn't think that maybe, if there's anything to this, that they shouldn't get some kind of financial remuneration. I don't think we should automatically figure, well, the guy's just out for money, but it didn't seem to be that important to him. More so was getting the story out. Giesbrecht emphasized that it should be publicized because of the big loss when Kennedy was killed, and because he wanted to make sure it would be properly handled and checked out. This is what Vincent had said to the FBI. He appeared not to be entirely confident in the FBI in this regard. During the conversation between the FBI and Vincent, Giesbrecht happened to phone again and requested the opportunity to talk to Agent Nelson when Vincent mentioned to Giesbrecht. Nelson indicated that his information had been taken seriously and passed on to the proper authorities, but that he could not be informed of the results of any further investigation. Now, I presume that's a standard procedure. I mean, they're getting so many bits of information coming in, like 25,000 different reports by the FBI. I mean, they couldn't be constantly going back and filling people in. Basically, they were taking information in, passing it on, and supposedly it was all being evaluated and sifted through. So he basically was told, you're not going to hear from us again. Giesbrecht told Nelson that he had received, quote, between 15 and 25 telephone calls, and no one would say anything on the phone. He said he felt he was being harassed, possibly because of the knowledge he has. He was informed that the FBI has no jurisdiction of the laws of Canada. It could be, this is speculation on my part again, that Giesbrecht was told at this time that it might be wise for him to not discuss this matter with anyone else for his own protection, given the fact that he did not live in the United States, and that's fair enough. The agent might genuinely have sensed that Giesbrecht was displaying a paranoid view of the situation and maybe overreacting, and with that in mind, advised him to try and put it out of his mind and let the FBI and Warren Commission deal with it. You got to remember, this is early on. This is back in the spring of '64. And maybe he was given that kind of advice. Just let the authorities deal with it. Just go about your normal life and try to forget about it right As for Vincent's impression of Giesbrecht outlined in his final page of the summary, he believed that the man was honest and sincere, but at the same time referred to him as being childlike with a secret he must tell. The clear implication which subsequent FBI memos on the subject emphasized was the fact that such a person, like a child, can't be trusted. Now, I just pointed out that that's ridiculous to call someone childlike, because children quite often are not listened to when they tell you that they've just been molested by somebody, right? And 9 times out of 10, they're telling you the truth. So Vincent suspected that Giesbrecht was looking for financial gain and described him as a typical car salesman, always changing jobs, and the beer drinking type, with a rotund appearance. Now, I learned from Backlund that he had handled legal matters for Richard Giesbrecht and his brother for several years. They owned their own business. He wasn't a car salesman jumping from job to job. I also learned from the writer of the Free Press article, Don Newman, who's now up there in the CBC News in Ottawa, that Giesbrecht had initially gone to the airport to show a car to a prospective buyer, and that's why he was out there in the first place. And it might have been a Cadillac or a Rolls Royce, who knows. Vincent seemed skeptical that Giesbrecht would take notes. I mean, again, and then throw them away. I mean, if I was in his shoes, I'd probably do the same thing. And could not make up his mind as to whether it was a hoax or not. He planned to discourage future contact and would suggest that Giesbrecht speak to the RCMP if he feels his life is in danger. Now, I've written to this Richard V. Vincent. I've spoken to his wife twice. She sounds quite nervous about it all. I don't know how old he is, but I have a feeling he was fairly young then. He's still, I mean, just the fact it was 27, 28 years ago, let's say he's 60 today, that would make him 32, if he's 50 today, that would make him 22. So I think, he's probably a fairly young guy, and, in a pretty scary situation maybe. Although Giesbrecht did contact this local paper, which wrote a front page article, which I have here if anyone wants to look at it, front page in the Winnipeg Free Press, making reference to the FBI agent by name. No reference in the article was made to Giesbrecht's earlier contact with Vincent. So, for some reason or another, there was no mention of this contact with his TV station. 3 years later, when Giesbrecht again contacted the paper, which was followed by interviews with McLean's and another Winnipeg paper, convinced that one of the two men he overheard was David Ferry, which I went into in my original article. Again, no mention was made of Vincent. However, in the course of his interview with the Inquirer, he did describe phoning the television station, and Vincent himself was subsequently interviewed. So these guys actually interviewed Mr. Vincent, which is more than anyone else had done. It's the first time that the media had actually made contact with this man to try to verify Giesbrecht's story. According to Giesbrecht, when he was interviewed by Vincent, an audio tape was made, and he agreed to phone again in 2 days to see if the station wanted the interview on videotape. At this time, Giesbrecht spoke to Nelson, as has been stated in the FBI report, and allegedly Nelson warned Giesbrecht that he not make his information public because he could jeopardize the safety of himself and his family. Giesbrecht claimed that he was told at this point that it was too big, which had been mentioned in the McLean's article, and in answer to the question as to what and whom he should fear, Nelson indicated he couldn't tell him anything. Okay, so it looks like the warning came not when he was interviewed back on February the 13th, but in the course of a telephone conversation between Giesbrecht and Nelson, that Nelson possibly warned him to be quiet and not go around publicizing this for his own safety. Contrary to the FBI report, Vincent was quoted as being impressed with the apparent honesty of the man and felt he was telling the truth, but decided not to run his story. We are a small station and did not have the resources to check it out. By the way, that station later was transferred to Winnipeg, and it's now a Canadian television station. And they changed the letters from KCND to CKND. So, I guess that it just wasn't a money-making operation down in Pembina, so that they ended up probably a change of ownership too, I presume. Vincent also revealed that Nelson quite often stopped by the television station on various matters. I don't know why an FBI agent would be stopping by a television station on the border periodically, but maybe they just were good friends, and was there purely by chance when Giesbrecht phoned, resulting in a three-way conversation. As a result of this discussion with Nelson, Giesbrecht kept quiet, and that's a quote from this Inquirer article. So he did, at that point, sort of decide to cooperate and not speak about it anymore. And he kept quiet for 2 years, basically, 2 or 3 years. Today, Mr. Vincent lives in Winnipeg and appears to be reluctant to discuss this subject. The reason I say he's reluctant is that he actually phoned me one night and he left a message, but it got cut off. And it's, usually you can leave up to like 5 minutes on those message machines. And he said something like, I'm returning your call and maybe we should get together sometime, and then all of a sudden it got cut off.
Peter, you've got it off there.
Okay, now
Discuss that much of it,
Right.
then we have the paper.
Right. What I like, and I can see from looking at the clock that no way I can get through all this. You all got a copy. Don't even need to publish the third decade, because lots of people get to read it. Read the rest of it at your own leisure. And I'm not finished with it. I still need to go to Winnipeg to try to talk to some of these people. It might be a hoax. I might find out the whole thing's a hoax. But so far, and unfortunately, because of time restraint, I didn't really get to deal too much with the FBI documents, but they're all dealt with in the latter half of the article. Okay? So.
Thank you. All right.
Shall I sit down or just?
Well, first thing I have to say is I'm really impressed by the amount of time and energy that I've put into this paper. There's all sorts of good information here. The first thing that struck me, though, was I'm not a lawyer, but from what I understand, you can record a conversation and have it admissible in court, but this, I think, would fall under the category of a hearsay and would not be admissible in court. So I don't know if that could be one of the reasons why he did not testify at the Garrison trial. But another thing is that it might also shed some light on why ABC or some major news United States place didn't run with the story, because I think that would open them up to a slander suit, although I don't know if Mr. Isaacs would be in a position to sue.
No, I'm not a lawyer either, but I believe that overhearing of a conspiratorial conversation of any kind is admissible. I mean, it's frequently done.
Well,
I mean, it's one of the exemptions to hearsay without validity. Again.
okay, yeah, I didn't think that was true, but possibly is true. The other thing is, I was a little confused by Mr. Isaacs was working as a ticket agent, not a pilot. I wasn't clear as what he was doing, meeting with somebody in Winnipeg, if he worked in Texas.
No, they referred to a man named Isaacs.
But you
The
weren't-
two guys that were talking, neither one of them was Isaacs. They made references to Isaacs.
I see. Okay, I'm confused about that as well. The other thing was, a question I had was, David Ferry, was he an Eastern pilot at that time, or had he already been dismissed? And I was a little confused as why Winnipeg, if there's people in Dallas and New Orleans connected with this. How did Winnipeg get into the...
I have no idea, and I'm not even convinced it's necessarily David Ferry. To answer your first question, he had been dismissed by then. I think he appealed it in the latter part of '63.
He had been dismissed by
Yeah, he was finished as a pilot. There's indications if he was there, it wasn't as a commercial pilot. He might have flown in on a private. Garrison claimed that they confirmed that he was there, that he had flown in that day. According to secondhand information, by people like William Turner, they supposedly confirmed that Ferry had flown a private plane possibly on its way to somewhere else.
Winnipeg? Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
Maybe just to go fishing or hunting.
yeah, it could very well be.
It's a nice place, actually. Yeah, ice skating, right. Roller skating.
Well, that was about all I had. The other thing was, again, I'm not familiar with how the National Enquirer was in '68, but again, from the 60 Minutes piece, they do seem to take a germ of the truth and just expand on it. So, for what that's worth,
I did find an article in Time or Newsweek from around '69 or so, where they were trying to improve their image and really revamped the magazine, and they were for the first time putting it on the newsstands and in supermarkets and that. But they seem to be trying, obviously didn't try too hard to improve their overall news coverage at that time.
Okay, well, that's all I had.
Peter, I think there are 3 Canadian Oswald, maybe Oswald doubles on Blue One. There may be 3 Canadian occurrences of a possible Oswald double. Blue One. Number 2, there are several occurrences of people speaking to what may be an Oswald double, which are constitute overheard conversations, possibly conspiratorial. May be a part of the larger, but first initially at Oswald, and then do you have anything for MPT1, what it means? Because I think I know what
it means. Minneapolis informer number 1. That's all it means. Well, it didn't mean member of parliament.
Got it. On Tuesday, October 9th, 1985, 11:30 a.m. If you've got a universal calendar, Tuesday, October 9th will be helpful in terms of fixing that. If you already know the year, that's just...
What page is that?
That's page 6.
Yeah.
Because on Tuesday, October 9th only shows up periodic, like...
Oh, yeah, right, in the notebook.
Yes, you
right.
can check it. You can also ask American Airlines, once you have the year, about Flight 985, they frequently reuse flight numbers.
Oh, yeah.
Good. You can ask them, then you might get...
Good point.
And 11:30 a.m. does not sound like departure, it sounds like arrival.
Yeah. By the way, since I wrote this, I did locate a Charles Isaacs, no middle initial. I located a Charles Isaacs in, right on the coast of Texas, Corpus Christi. And I phoned him, and he said he'd never worked for American Airlines. And I said he'd never live in Dallas, and he laughed. He said, Dallas? Well, I mean, it's another part of Texas. What's so funny about that? But, and my initial reaction was, I got the wrong guy. But, if he was the real guy, he's not exactly going to admit it to someone over the phone he doesn't even know, right? Corpus Christi's not that far from San Antonio. It's just down the coast, just down on the coast, southeast of San Antonio. And so, maybe that's... And he's the only Charles Isaacs, other than the one in Royce City in all of Texas, that's got a listed phone number. Yeah?
Have you tried contacting the airline to get a social security number and do a skip trace on them?
Well, I did call American Airlines, and they're not going to provide information on pilots, but that was when I thought he was a pilot. But now that I find out that he's not a pilot, maybe I could do that, yeah. Yeah, by the way, for instance, the gentleman that was a little confused on Isaacs. Now, if you haven't read the original article, of course, it would be very hard to follow. But some of the conversations that he overheard, they were really concerned about this Isaacs. That he was shown on film footage. He appeared on film footage at the landing, which the garrison people seem to think was Love Field, and he was at the wrong place. He shouldn't have been there, and that they were going to meet at the Townhouse Motor Hotel, which I'll get into later on, which supposedly was in Kansas City, but the FBI listed in their report the actual streets, Kellogg and Broadway. And I called information, and I said, we got a listing for a Townhouse Motor Hotel on Kellogg and Broadway in Kansas City. And it was a male operator, and he said, that's not in Kansas City, that's in Wichita, because that's where I live. And sure enough, Kellogg and Broadway are in downtown Wichita. And I got a listing from the library for Townhouse Motor Hotel. It had that name until 1979, and it was on 612 Broadway. Okay? So there was a hotel with that name, but it was in Wichita, not Kansas City.
Peter, I'm not absolutely sure what your goal is in this research. In about 2 or 3 sentences, can you tell us what you are trying to prove here?
Well, I'm trying to prove that this really happened, that he didn't make it up.
That the conversation
That it really happened, and that it was a conversation involving men that were involved either directly or indirectly in the assassination.
One of whom was David Perry?
No, not necessarily. I don't necessarily buy it was David Perry. As I say later in the article, it looked like by the time he got in contact with Garrison, that maybe Garrison's people kind of put pressure on him to modify his description a little bit to fit Perry, because they did that with Perry Russo, which I've learned. They put a lot of pressure on Perry Russo to play ball with them. Now, in terms of David, or the lookalike, if you read the original report on the FBI report, this is a detailed description of this man, and it fits David Ferry, except he had dark glasses, a solid, hard, what do you call it? It's kind of Buddy Holly type glasses.
What about the false eyebrows?
He had bushy eyebrows in the original report, but the description of his hair was just dark hair. He didn't describe whether it was bushy or smooth or anything.
With a reddish carpet.
Yeah, right. They didn't say that. Now, that's why I'm a little suspicious that it maybe wasn't David Ferry. Yeah.
Peter, I wasn't going to say anything. I think it's a very good paper, but you just brought up an important point that I think we should all bear in mind in our investigations and research, and that is, when we're investigating a question of anything at all in this case, let's try not necessarily to prove that it really happened, but let's try to either prove it or disprove it. But let's be impartial,
right,
and keep an open mind. Sure. When the investigations that I'm doing, I did not have a preconceived bias. I'm trying to find, and we're all trying to find, whether or not it works or it's true. But we shouldn't start having constructs.
By the way, I spoke to this man in '87 3 times. I called BC Tel and got a reprint of my phone bill at that time. I spoke to him for 3 minutes on October 8th, 1987, 7 minutes on October 14th, and 20 minutes on November 19th. And that call was when he had visitors. He asked if I could hang on while he went to another phone and talked to me in kind of a hushed voice for 20 minutes. He pretended he was a relative. He said he was a very close relative, but he wasn't the man himself. I did subsequently discover that it was him, because I found out his address it was printed in the Winnipeg paper later on. But he said he talked like he was an uncle or something. I thought for a long time maybe he was an uncle. No, he invited me to his home. He said, if you ever come to Winnipeg, I'd rather talk to you in person rather than on the phone. And I said, well, maybe I can make it next year. And I never did. And then unfortunately he died of cancer last year, age 57. And he had retired at 48. He was an extremely successful life insurance salesman. I got actually an obituary from the man who he was visiting when he saw the picture of Ferry, because his name was mentioned in a subsequent article. And he's a Mennonite as well, Peter Thiessen. And he sent me an obituary. It's a beautiful obituary. The man made so much money in the life insurance business that he retired at 48 and spent more time with his family. He had a daughter who died in a drowning accident. I thought it was in Detroit. I thought he said near Detroit, but it turns out it was Detroit Lakes, apparently, in Minnesota, which makes more sense because that's close to Winnipeg. And she died in a drowning accident in 1969 when she was 15 years old. And her death is mentioned in the obituary, although it doesn't say the cause. But he implied that, and maybe he just got paranoid, that it looked to be foul play involved. But all this time, though, when he was talking, it was his third person, like it was someone else. His wife is still living in Winnipeg. She's got the phone still listed under her husband's name. He's got a son named Richard Giesbrecht Jr. who didn't know anything about it, who's in his 30s. And he even said he'd help me try to find the guy because I thought it wasn't him. And then I sent him a copy of the McLean's article, which had his dad's picture in it. And of course, then he realized obviously it was his dad. And he told me later that he tried to speak to his dad about it. His dad told him to never mention it again, and he never did. Yeah.
Do you think you'll ever discover why he wasn't used by Garrison?
I'm really glad you asked that. I wrote to Garrison in the fall of '87. I didn't get a reply, and I've written about 6 times since. I sent him my article for the third decade. His secretary assured me that he got the article. I phoned later to ask if he could send it back, and I got it. And he mailed it back with no. The secretary mailed it back, with the judge's address on the envelope, and with no note inside. Nothing. Not even thank you very much. Just the article sent back. It had been folded over. It looked like he had it stuffed in his back pocket because it's kind of creased in the middle. But that's what I need to do. Perry Russo asked him about it, and he said he didn't want to discuss it. Yeah.
The idea of something like Canada is unusual. The
CAA special on Martin Luther King.
No, I missed that.
That goes into,
Oh, I know, in Toronto. I brought that before, four aliases all from the same area as Toronto. I read Donald's book.
that's expanded on in the article, a whole bunch for wise time, which came out shortly after the special, and the related information hasn't gotten to it.
And isn't there, it's still classified as document, the alleged sighting of Oswald in Montreal?
Yes,
That's still classified, that's close.
Mary has listed that, I think, very early.
And Ferry did phone various places in Canada frequently.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
The Canadian connection.
Yeah, that's what it is right there. They can read it themselves.
Not listed on the program. Originally, told me that he didn't think he'd be able to do a presentation here, and told me this morning after arriving that it looked like he would be able, and fortunately I had this time set aside for that or other possibilities. So this time I'm going to ask Monty Evans to talk to the group about his research. I'm not sure what he'll do, but I presume it'll be focused on connections between the Kennedy and other assassinations. He sent me a chapter from the Rather narrative, the saga of Dan Rather, one part of which was published in the third decade under the title of Dan Rather in Dallas. And so I'll be distributing that chapter, that additional chapter called More Assassinations, I believe, is the title. And welcome, Monty Evans.
I hope you all forgive me. I didn't prepare anything. I just sat back there and whizzed through my book and jotted down a few notes. I'm going to be primarily talking about two chapters from my book, The Rabbit Narrative. I'm a fumbler. Is Dan Rabbit, the JFK Conspiracy, San Andreas Vault, which as Dr. Rose mentioned, appeared in the September issue last September the 3rd.
We're going to adjourn for much needed rest. And come back fresh, ready to go again this evening at 8 o'clock. The location of the meeting this evening is 209 McLean. McLean is the, should have a map, but it sits behind this new construction, this new library construction on the far side, which is immediately adjacent to the Benton issue. Okay. It's on the third floor.
Get your choices. Pizza Hut, one each time.
Welcome. I'm glad so many people were able to find this well-hidden place, but hopefully it's worth looking for, because I think you'll find it comfortable here, which, as you know, in these days, in this area, you're not going to find that many comfortable places. So we'll be cool, at least as far as the climate's concerned here tonight. We're here to hear and respond to an address by a distinguished author and student of the John F. Kennedy assassination, Mr. John H. Davis, resident of New York City. And this meeting this evening is part of the third decade research conference, which is convening over this weekend at Fredonia State. We have, for those of you who are not part of the convention itself, you might be interested to know that we have some, I think last count, some 65 people from really all over the United States and Canada even. We have people from Vancouver and Montreal, people from California, Virginia, and across the country. All people who share a common interest, not necessarily always the same viewpoint. Some of our sessions have been heated and will be heated. But we all share, as I'm sure all of you do who come out tonight, a common interest in I think what we all pretty well agree is the unsolved mystery of the murder of our former president. It's a crime, of course, of which there are a great many so-called theories. Mr. Davis will be discussing what one might call a theory of the assassination. He has discussed in his work, and will share that with us tonight. And I'm sure, and he's told me to be responsive to your questions and your comments. Mr. Davis, for our purposes, I guess he's most known as the author of the book, this is the paperback version of his book called Mafia Kingfish. And the subtitle is indicative of the perspective of the book. The subtitle is Carlos Marcello and the Assassination of John F. Kennedy. And it does detail the various strands of suspicion that the former organized crime boss of New Orleans, Mr. Marcello, may have been a major, or his apparatus, may have been a major agency in the assassination. Mr. Davis is also the author of a book that was published several years ago and is in process of being reissued this summer, I believe. Pardon? In the fall. Mr. Davis has shared with me the information about his book. Well, I should mention its name, The Kennedys, Dynasty and Disaster, a more general biographical treatment of the Kennedy family. But Mr. Davis has shared with me that he has been revising the chapter on the assassination of John F. Kennedy for the purposes of this new edition of the Kennedys. I guess he had a publisher's deadline that fell just about right now, and he convinced his publisher to put off that deadline so that he could incorporate things that he might have learned for this conference in the way that he revises the chapter. Mr. Davis, I know from long association with him, is not only a writer, a teacher, but also a learner. He listens very well. He doesn't always agree with what he hears, but he has done his homework as far as familiarity with the information that the research community has to offer. He's a graduate of Princeton University. He majored in the Italian, I guess, at Columbia, and taught for a number of years in the Italian Institute for Historical Studies in Naples, Italy. Close. A Fulbright student there, I'm saying. If you wanted to lecture in Italian, he could probably do it, but I don't think he'll do that. He is not Italian himself, but he said he developed an interest in that when he was in the military service and stationed in that region of the world. It's certainly an honor for our community to have this distinguished man to share his views with us, and I'm very pleased to present Mr. John Davis.
Thank you, Jerry. And thank you to all of you who came this evening. I understand we have the general public here in addition to those attending the third decade conference, and I want to thank you for coming. It's a great pleasure to have you here. I'm going to talk tonight on two contending factions within the Kennedy assassination research community, which seem to be constantly at war with one another, and are often not very civil with one another. Those who are convinced that organized crime played a preponderant role in the Kennedy assassination, and those who believe that the CIA, or if not the CIA, the United States government, played a preponderant role in the assassination conspiracy. So that's what we're going to talk about. When you write a book of this kind, you put yourself in an extremely contentious position. And I didn't realize it until I went out on a tour promoting Mafia Kingfish, which I went 2 cross-country tours, New York to Los Angeles and back. And the contentiousness sometimes is really startling. For example, I did a television show in New Orleans about a year and a half ago. And it was, there was this big studio audience, it was a live show, and the hostess invited Jim Garrison, the former district attorney, who conducted a very much publicized investigation of the assassination back in '67 and '68. And to my utter horror, she invited the entire Marcello family. And when she told me that in the green room, I said, I got to go out and face Jim Garrison and all the Marcellos. And as it turned out, Jim Garrison didn't come, but he sent an emissary. And at a certain point, as the show got underway, he stood up and he said, I come here on behalf of District, well, he was a Judge Jim Garrison. And I want to tell you something about that book of yours. Mr. Garrison considers it C-R-A-P. This is a live show. You know, it's kind of embarrassing. I mean, you know what C-R-A-P is. And so I said, well, he said, title that opinion. And then I said, is there anybody here from the Marcello family? And it turned out there was one nephew of one of Carlos Marcello's brothers. He looked rather inoffensive, so I wasn't scared to death. I was a little scared, but I wasn't totally terrified. Anyway, people are very contentious in this field. I was out in Los Angeles, and a Kennedy assassination researcher who is completely convinced that the CIA was behind this crime turned to me one afternoon and he said, you know, I know all about you. You're a CIA front, and you're trying to draw attention away from the CIA's complicity in this crime by blaming it on Carlos Marcello and organized crime. That's what you are. I know it. It's written all over you. You're a CIA guy. That was absolutely preposterous. I mean, it's sheer madness. But you run into this kind of thing in this business. At any rate, let's start off giving the case for possible CIA involvement in this crime of the century. First of all, we have the extremely enigmatic character and activities of the principal suspect of the assassination, Lee Harvey Oswald. Was he an agent of U.S. intelligence? Often he seems to be. Was he a genuine defector to the Soviet Union, or was he a CIA fake defector? Why did the Soviets give him such a magnificent apartment in Minsk, where he worked in a factory, an apartment that no other Soviet worker of his class would ever receive. What was behind his highly visible demonstrations in behalf of Fidel Castro in New Orleans? Was his so-called historic diary a phony? And what was the purpose of it anyway? And there's so many mysteries associated with Oswald. We went over this afternoon. Did Oswald visit the Cuban and Soviet embassies in Mexico City? Or did Oswald Imposter visit them? We still don't really know. What was behind his alias, H.A. Hidell? Who gave him that alias? Did he cook it up himself, or did an intelligence agency give it to him? Did the Russian defector Yuri Nosenko lie about Oswald when he said that the KGB wasn't at all interested in Oswald? And was Oswald connected to the KGB? And you can make out a case for that too. See, Oswald touched all bases. This is what makes him so enigmatic, what makes us seem to believe that he did have some intelligence connection. He touches the mafia, the FBI, the CIA, the Cuban exiles, and even the Soviet Union. In the spring of 1963, an FBI informant went to the FBI office, into an FBI field office, and said that he saw Lee Harvey Oswald in Carlos Marcello's headquarters in New Orleans. Carlos Marcello was the leader of the most powerful mafia family in the southwest, Louisiana, Texas. He said he saw Oswald in Carlos Marcello's headquarters accepting an envelope from one of Marcello's top lieutenants. He didn't know he was a top lieutenant, but this was the individual he thought he saw Oswald accept an envelope from. Then, in the summer of 1963, a man by the name of Adrian Alba in a Crescent City garage sees Oswald accept an envelope from an FBI agent who was in a Secret Service car. So here we have the mafia, we have the FBI. Late August 1963, a Cuban exile leader, Antonio Veciano, sees Oswald with a noted CIA agent who called himself Maurice Bishop. So now we have the CIA in the picture. And then in November 1963, a woman in Dallas, Cuban woman by the name of Sylvia Odio, meets a certain Leon Oswald in the company of very rabid anti-Castro Cuban exiles. So Oswald, this backwards. One minute he's with the mafia, the next minute he's with the FBI, then the CIA and the Cuban exiles. A very enigmatic person who leads us to believe that he had some intelligence connection, although we've never figured out what it was. Let's go on then to the case for CIA involvement. About a year ago, at an assassination researchers convention in San Francisco, I met Edwin Lopez, who was a member of the staff of the House Select Committee on Assassinations, and the man charged with investigating the whole question of whether Oswald actually visited the Cuban and Soviet embassies in Mexico City. And he went down there and he conducted a very thorough investigation. He wrote up a